Good afternoon, everyone. And as Vice President of the Economic Society of Singapore, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our webinar on COVID-19 and the structural crises of our time. The webinar is meant to recognize the launch of the book of the same title, written by Dr. Lim Ma Hui and Dr. Michael Heng. Both authors are longtime observers of the political, economic, and business landscapes in Asia, and have written extensively about the key issues of the day. Ma Hui has been a professional banker, an academic, and has been involved in policymaking in his days at the Asian Development Bank. Michael was a professor of management and has taught in Europe and Australia, besides authoring several books, including two on recent financial crises. Aside from the fact that both Ma Hui and Michael are highly respected observers of Asia, ESS is pleased to be organizing this event for a number of reasons. One is the unique approach that they take, which enables us to appreciate this crisis in all its dimensions. You know, President Obama's former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, is reported to have said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." Ma Hui and Michael have taken this to heart. They have addressed the issue of COVID in a different way, using a multi-disciplinary approach, weaving economics, politics, and history together. The important point they make, and I think it is fair to say that few others have made this point with the same rigor, is that the pandemic we have endured for 2 years is not just a medical crisis, but one which arose out of the way the political economy has been configured and how it has evolved over the past 3 decades or so. And in so doing, they have reminded us that economic events cannot be studied independently of politics, history, and the society they are embedded in. The second reason ESS is happy to organize this event is that the authors extend their analysis to show that the great challenges of the day, such as climate change and the greater frequency of financial stresses and crises, as well as the current pandemic, all have roots in the same phenomenon of how the political economy has been structured over these decades. Finally, the authors also provide us with some thoughts on how the global economy might evolve over time, what the possible scenarios are, and that helps us to understand what to expect in future. My role here is to moderate the discussion, so I shouldn't steal the thunder from Ma Hui. The format for today's webinar is simple. We will first have opening remarks introducing his book by Ma Hui. We then have another set of introductory remarks by Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Kishore is one of those people who really don't need an introduction. You get a lot of events where the moderator says that so-and-so doesn't need an introduction, he's being very polite. But in this case, Kishore actually doesn't need an introduction. He's a great observer, and his latest book has just come out, and it has got a tremendous following with, what's it, Kishore, about 600,000 downloads in the first couple of weeks. Amazing, probably a record. So we will have 20 minutes from Kishore as well. And then we will turn over to Dr. Karl Polanyi, who is the Chief Economist of the ASEAN +3 Macroeconomic Research Office, to give his views and perspectives on the book as well. Hui has been a long-time observer of Asian economies in various roles in the IMF, in the ADB, and now at AMRO. So we look forward to his comments as well. After that, we will then open up for questions and comments. And I look forward to hearing from you, the audience. I hope to see a robust and thoughtful exchange of ideas. And then we will bring the webinar to an end promptly at 6 o'clock. So without further ado, let me now turn to Ma Hui and invite him to make his comments. And Ma Hui, as time is short, so let's stick to 20 minutes if possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
No, Ma Hui, you're on mute again. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, okay now.
You,
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay, fine. Thanks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank, of course, the organizers, ESS, for this book launch and webinar, and of course, my distinguished panelists for participating to enhance the conversation. I started the book by asking three basic questions. What is the nature of the crisis that confronts us today? Second, how did we get to this state of affair? And third, what should we do? Do we go back to business as usual, or does the crisis offer us an opportunity to rethink and reshape our economy and politics? And Manu has already given actually a little bit of a snapshot of what I'm going to do. My book is based on the work of Karl Polanyi, whose magnum opus called The Great Transformation, Origins of Our Time, written in 1940s and published in 1950s, so 70, 80 years ago. And I want to answer the three questions in terms of what I call the three great transformations. The first great transformation, which was what Polanyi wrote about, right? Starting in late 18th century in England, which what we can understand today is the transformation from agrarian feudal society to industrial capital society, which of course brought about a huge spurt in economic growth, productivity, and all that, competition, innovation. But at the same time, it had a lot of negative consequences, which some of us may not want to talk about. Okay? But central to this, all these three great transformations, is the concept of the market. That, what is the relationship between market, economy, and society? What Karl Polanyi was saying that and before that, to understand the market, then he deconstructs or unpacks the concept of market into three levels. Market as an economic tool or economic institution, market economy, and market society, right? So the first great transformation is about the overturning of the relationship between market and society. For thousands of years, market as an economic institution where people bring their goods and services to exchange and to distribute and all the stuff has existed. But it existed in many forms, as reciprocative, as barter and other redistributive forms. But the central point Polanyi was saying is that market was embedded in society, served social norms, and subordinate to society. Then came this great transformation where this relationship was overturned, where market, which is an economic tool, expanded into all spheres of spheres of life, including the natural. You're now bringing not only produce goods and services to the market, you now turn to the marketization or commoditization of the natural elements of life, namely human beings or men, and nature like trees and land. He's best encapsulated in this thing where men as human beings with intrinsic value now become simply a commodity to be bought and sold by the industrialists. So man becomes labor. It's a commodity to be bought and sold. Trees, which are important for nature and life and all that, is simply timber to be cut and to be bought and sold. And we might know that in about 20, 30 or 40 years, the white Americans went into California and basically destroyed all the redwood trees and forests in 20, 30 years. Became timber. And finally, land becomes real estate. Land which has an intrinsic relationship with people now becomes rent asunder. It's bought and sold, right? So totally what he's saying is that now it's not just market is an economic institution. Market has become the economy, where the economic system is controlled, regulated, and directed by markets and markets alone. So that we have entered then into the second level of the market economy. And the third level is what we experienced today in the last 30, 40 years, that the principles of market now not only exist in the economic sphere, now it penetrates and infuses all the non-economic spheres, including our personal relationships, communal life, in the educational sector, health sector, culture, politics, even religion. When people talk about prosperity religion, okay, and for-profit prison system, where instead of rehabilitating people, the for-profit prison systems wants to put more and more people into the prison and keep them longer and longer so they can make money. This is in extreme form market society that we are in, right? So, and this is the paragraph that motivated me to write this book. I want to say that market is, as I say, has got positive results, but there are also negative consequences. And Polanyi 70 years ago already said, no, human beings would perish and be destroyed from vice, perversion, crime, starvation, or extreme inequality. Nature would be reduced to its elements, where landscape are defiled, rivers polluted, and he might have had, but of course he couldn't have, that the air we breathe, we can't breathe today because it's too polluted and all that stuff, and global warming. And finally, we will have economic and financial crisis, which would liquidate business and lead to bankruptcy. So this is what he predicted 70 years ago. So I then applied this framework to understand the environmental crisis, health crisis, financial crisis, political crisis. So underlying all this crisis is the theme of what is the relationship, what is the correct relationship between market, economy, and society. And very quickly, we know that for more than 800,000 years, the greenhouse gas emission was pretty steady and below 300 parts per million. And it's only in the last few decades that's gone up to now 400 parts per million. And on the right-hand side of this chart, you see the global warming temperature that has shot up since 1960s. So what explains this basically is that the Industrial Revolution, which uses large-scale use of coal in England, and later on in the US, petroleum and all that. This enable huge explosion of productivity. But now we know that there are planetary and ecological costs, that we can't continue to do that. It's disrupted the balance between nature and people and economy. And that when you have an economic system that simply produces for the sake of profit, it leads to endless growth and endless consumption. Okay? And I think the last point I want to make is that, who are the greatest polluters? It's not just even countries, like China or India and all that, but we should look in terms of companies. The 100 largest companies in the world since the 1980s responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emission. The source is from Riley and Test, Riley Test in 2017 in The Guardian, right? So it doesn't matter whether it is companies, market-oriented companies that are existing as state institutions, state-owned market corporations, or whether it's private. But the logic is that you need to grow, you need to consume, you need to put more and more pollution into the atmosphere in order to make profit. And then in terms of the health crisis, modern day, we have gone through flu epidemics, Spanish, Asian, Hong Kong flu, avian flu, and now we have, SARS-CoV-2, which is what we are going through. And then there are other viruses which Asians are quite familiar with, especially Nipah virus, which originated in Malaysia. The point I'm trying to make, there is a big relationship between human economic activities and its impact on ecology and health. And there are two. One is deforestation. That planting, to make way for agriculture, for plantation, for mining and all the stuff. And the forests, tropical home forests, forests are home to more than 1 million types of viruses in mammals and in birds and all the stuff. And when you destroy this stuff, right, that viruses get passed on from human beings, from animals to human beings. We call it zoonosis. And 1/3 of emerging diseases are due to changes, these massive changes in land use. That source is from Doug Zuck's book, article in 2020. And since the 1980s, the frequency of zoonosis have gone from 1,000 to 3,000 by 2010. I don't have the latest figure, it must be much more. So what we are saying is that, and finally, a very important book by Wallace called Big Farm, Big Flu. The point he's making is that industrial farming, large-scale production of livestock and packing them into densely packed conditions, living conditions, and genetically modifying it, right, reduces their resistance, increases the chance, transmissibility, and virulence of flu epidemic. And we have seen this in the case of the swine flu, avian flu, and the Nipah virus. Now, I go to the second great transformation, which is, of course, this could not have been foreseen by Polanyi, because he passed away by then. But this happened in the 1970s, basically with the rise of neoliberalism, free market economy and all that, where finance now becomes the center of economic activity. The economic, what they call production as the center of economic activity has shifted from manufacturing, right, into finance. And finance, which should serve the real economy, now becomes its master and it dominates it. And what are some of the aspects of this financialization of the economy? The elements are, as we said, center of gravity is shifted from production to financial circulation. They're more interested in value extraction rather than value creation. And economic growth is driven by putting more and more debt into households and governments and corporations rather than productivity, and rather involved in speculative rather than long-term investments. And then the proliferation of fictitious financial products, which Warren Buffett calls financial weapons of mass destruction. Now, we don't have the time to talk about all these complex things, which perhaps Poi could talk about a little bit, or we can in our discussion, how this has set the stage for repeated financial crises. Now, this chart or figure is very interesting. Kishore and I lived in New York, and we will probably mistake this for the New York skyscraper skyline. But what it is showing on the left-hand side of the chart, you see all those columns there? It means that there was frequent and huge financial crisis before 1930s when things were deregulated. It was a cowboy financial system. And that culminated in this huge financial depression in 1930s. And then came Roosevelt, and he separated investment banking from commercial banking and introduced a lot of regulations to regulate finance. Then for 40 years, 1935 to 1970s, finance was tame. It was boring. It was doing what it was supposed to do, but we didn't have financial crisis. Then came 1970s rise of neoliberalism, deregulation under Margaret Thatcher and under Reagan, and also Clinton and Obama. And that set the stage for repeated huge financial crises, which we are quite familiar with. For example, in the 1980s, you have the Latin American banking crisis. 1990s, most of us lived through huge Asian financial crisis. 10 years later, 1989 2008, sorry, is the global financial crisis. And we are, at the cusp of the next financial crisis. Now the question becomes, is If it is the nature and in the DNA of finance to make profits and to get us into trouble and financial crisis, what is the role of the state and central banks? Isn't it supposed to preserve financial stability? Supposedly it is. And one of, I think it was Lawrence, one of the central bankers in federal bank governor in United States says that, when the party is becomes too rowdy, it is the role of the central bank to take away the punch bowl so that people don't get drunk and the party gets destroyed. But unfortunately, the reverse has taken place, particularly started in the 1980s with Greenspan, where financial people who say they got a Greenspan put. Essentially, that means whenever there is a financial crisis, the central bank will come in, print money, lower interest rates, and resuscitate the economy and the financial system, which it would. But this would basically encourage more debt, and it will create more asset bubble, and it will worsen economic inequality, which we are all seeing, right? And so I don't have the time, but it's in the book. I go into depth as to what the central banks, particularly the Fed, has been doing since the global financial crisis, is setting up the stage for an even bigger financial crisis. And this is just a chart to show that the global debt went from 250% of GDP before the global financial crisis to today to 330% of GDP. So finally, the question becomes, what do we do? Do we go back to business as usual, or we chart a new narrative? Do we become part of the problem, or do we become part of the solution? And I want to put it in simple form. On the left-hand part of this figure is what we have today. It's a system of pyramid where profit sits on the apex, and it determines people's future and the planet's future. And as long as we are going to maximize profit, we will gouge people and we will gouge the planet. And we will have to live with those consequences. What I think we should move is towards the reversal or overturning of this pyramid. So the profit becomes subordinate to people and planet, right? And that the agents and actors should not simply be the market at one extreme, or the state, the communist state, or the free market, but not just simply a mixture of the two. But more importantly, I think the role of civil society has to be enhanced and taken into account so that we have a circular, symbiotic relationship and the correct balance between civil society, market, and state. And definitely, we must break up the capture of the state by the market. Because even in the liberal democracy, where we talk about one person, one vote, we don't have that. We have $1, one vote. The guy who has got the most money can buy all the politicians and put them in a pocket. He's the one that rules, not you and I, right? And this is my last but one slide. That this is the way the present narrative is a market economy. We should have chart a new narrative, social economy, and we can talk about what it means. Instead of maximizing growth, we must have sustainable growth. But even there is a new group is talking about degrowth, not stagnation, but we have to be very mindful of some areas we should grow, some areas we should not grow. We should in fact suppress growth. Some societies is growing too much and consuming too much, and others are not enough. So these are all the dynamics we have to discuss. And instead of what is on Wall Street today, maximize the rate of return on capital, we should introduce the socially acceptable rate of return of capital. It's important to make profit, but it must be controlled and regulated and socially acceptable. And as far as the financial landscape is concerned, we should rein in and control, and downplay profit-oriented banks, which are making, super profits. And we should promote social banks, community banks, and development banks. And finally, instead of top-down planning from the state and people, the politicians who knows best, we should have bottom-up planning from, participatory democracy. And I end with this slide. The people from the left or right and different persuasions, I think have, looking at the financial crisis, come to the same conclusion that, that there is too much power in the too big to fail banks. And this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, not from Lim Ma Hui. It says for a prosperous future, the nation must find lasting financial stability. But where? Not in the big financial institutions like JP Morgan, which are the center of the crisis, but in America's numerous community banks, which has demonstrated stability, and imparting their virtues to the financial system as a whole will require the end of financial institutions that are too big to fail. And I think we have to take this seriously. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mahui, for giving us a great overview and also for sticking to the time. May I now invite Professor Kishore Mahbubani to give his thoughts on the book as well. Kishore?
Thank you very much, Manu, and I appear as Lim Maui.
Brothers.
On the screen. But I don't want Lim Maui to be held accountable for what I'm going to say. But I want to begin by saying that I was very happy to participate in the launch of this book by Maui and Michael, because it is actually a very thought-provoking book. And, you know, for me, the mark of a great book is whether or not it stimulates your thinking. And I also believe, frankly, the role of a book is not necessarily to provide the answers to you, but actually to raise the right questions that you can start reflecting on. And I think what the big message of Maui and Michael, that something has gone fundamentally wrong in the state of international political economy, is fundamentally right. That there's absolutely no doubt that the world is facing several major crises. And the great thing that Maui and Michael have done in this book is give example after example after example that illustrates, you know, why do you have this financial crisis? Why do you have climate change challenges? How does the pandemic fit into it? So it's really a book that I think everyone should read. Now, the way I hope to complement Maui's remarks is by illustrating how his book has, in a sense, triggered my thought processes on many of the big questions that he raised. Because in my view, the big contribution that the West has made in terms of developing the world over the last few hundred years, there have been essentially three big ideas. The first big idea is democracy. The second big idea is capitalism. And the third big idea is globalization. And all three, by the way, have had phenomenal positive effects. But in all three cases, something has gone fundamentally wrong. And I think clues of why they've gone wrong are actually provided in the book of Maui and Michael. But I'm just going to give, in a sense, my sense of what's gone wrong in these three areas of democracy, capitalism, and globalization. By the way, I noticed that on page 144, Maui and Michael say, in essence, however, capitalism and democracy are incompatible. I hope they'll explain that remark and what they mean by that. Because I don't see, I see that they are incompatible in some ways, but compatible in other ways. But let me quickly, sticking within the 20 minutes, Manu, explain why I think things have gone wrong in each of these areas. Now, on democracy, basically, the United States today is functionally not a democracy. I mean, I know that's a shocking statement, but what is actually more shocking is that more people are not aware of it. That the United States today functionally is a plutocracy. And the one complaint I have against Maui and Michael is that they never use the word plutocracy anywhere in the book. I looked for it, but I couldn't find it. And I'll tell you why this is a serious omission. Because a democracy is essentially a system of government where you say it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. But functionally, the United States is no longer a democracy because it has now become a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. So the net effect of this is that even though, 150 million Americans go to the ballot boxes and drop their votes and think that they are actually deciding what is going to happen to their country, actually they're not. Their vote has no effect on the actual decisions that are made in the country. And so actually in my book, Has China Won, in chapter 7, I devote the whole chapter, Assumption of Virtue, to explain how it has become a plutocracy. But two scholars I cite are the two scholars from Princeton. They are Martin Gylens and Benjamin Page. And I want to just read out two paragraphs of what they say so you understand the point I'm trying to make. They found that, quote, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. And they add this: when the preferences of economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American, let me repeat that, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. Furthermore, the preferences of the economic elites, as measured by a proxy, the preferences of affluent citizens, have far more independent impact upon policy change than the preferences of average citizens do. And this is the conclusion. In the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. And so they go on to say, Americans do enjoy many features central to democratic governance, such as regular elections, freedom of speech and association, and a widespread, if still contested, franchise. But we believe that if policy making is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans, then America's claims to being a democratic society are seriously threatened. Now, Manu, I can tell you that since I wrote this book, there's been far more evidence confirming this. And in my latest book, which you referred to, which is surprisingly got 600,000 downloads, again, I devote another whole essay, long essay, on how America has become a plutocracy. So I think the first thing we need to do, if you want to analyze the problem, as they say, call a spade a spade. And if American democracy has functionally become a plutocracy, call it a plutocracy in the way that the late Paul Walker called it a plutocracy, Joseph Stiglitz calls it a plutocracy, Martin Wolf calls it a plutocracy. Let's not hide the real term. So that's the first thing where the West has gone on. The second one on capitalism, you know, the reason why capitalism worked very well, especially in the beginning, is that the original capitalists understood very well that if all the profits go to capital and none of the profits go to labor, you can produce all the products you want, but there'll be no customers for them, right? And that's why, as you know, that was the famous decision made by Henry Ford to raise the salaries of the workers in automobile plants so they could buy cars. So it's creating customers. Now, basically, and this is again documented in my book, As China Won, it's up to the 60s, 70s, 80s. The average income in the United States was going up. But in the last 30 years, essentially it has stagnated. And Danny Quah, by the way, has documented this, and I cite this in my book. And I think that's the critical point here, that the capitalists of today don't understand. And this is related to my first point. When they use their money to control Congress and then create laws that ensure that people at the top, Maui spoke a lot about how the financial sector has become very strong. How do they do that? They pass legislation to say that the earnings of hedge funds are not income. They're carried interest. So on carried interest, you pay less income tax. What's the net result of that? The secretaries and the bus drivers and the teachers pay much higher income taxes than the hedge fund managers. Now, something is fundamentally wrong with that, right? And so let's get to the core of this. And so the capitalists, who, as Maui describes in his book, were trying to take away all the profits and increase their profits. And by the way, I think this can all be statistically documented in terms of the share of the pie that used to go to labor and to capital. There has been an incredible switch away from labor. I think that's the problem, and that's what needs to be fixed. Because if you can persuade the capitalists not to use their economic power to seize political power, which they have done in terms of creating a plutocracy, then you will not have this problem of, by the way, this has essentially resulted in a very angry white working class in America, and that has also resulted in the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and also may result in the return of Donald Trump in 2024. So, all these points are related. And therefore, you got to analyze them very clearly and be very clear what the original sources are if you're going to fix it. And I actually believe that all these problems can be fixed, but to fix them, you've got to analyze them, analyze the real sources, and then deal with them. And then come to my last point. Anyway, just as an aside, when Maui was talking earlier about how the damage to the environment happened, a lot of that happened precisely also because the capitalists ensured that the social costs and environmental costs were not factored in, and they passed on the burden to society and they refused to let it affect their bottom lines. But we can push back against that. Now, the final point about globalization, and in each of these ideas, democracy, as I said, has done a lot of good in the initial phase, then got lost. Capitalism did a lot of good, then got lost. And I say mostly in the United States of America. And I would say Europe is a completely different model, and we've got to discuss it separately. Now, in the case of globalization, the paradox about globalization is that globalization has actually worked. And I would say the best proof of this is if you look at China, the only reason why China has rescued 800 million people out of absolute poverty is because, as Xi Jinping said in his Davos speech, China plunged into the ocean of globalization. It struggled to swim. It drank a lot of water, but essentially after that became a good swimmer. And it's China's, in a sense, participation in globalization that enabled the Chinese economy to become the fastest growing economy in the world over the last 30 to 40 years. And as the Chinese economists tell me, there are no anti-globalization protesters in China. You may find them in Seattle, you may find them in parts of Europe, but there are no anti-globalization protesters in China. And so, but right now, we have come to a rather paradoxical situation in the world that what was essentially an American gift to the world, the whole idea of free trade and how free trade improves welfare of everybody. You have this bizarre situation where the world's most capitalist society, the United States of America, rejects free trade agreements. And it is China today, right, which is not by any means a free society like the United States of America, that is a champion and great believer in globalization. And I think here, this is where I think I'm going to conclude with this point. And this is why the book by Maui and Michael is very important. The time has come for the Asian mind to be decolonized. Well, I would say that if you ask me what's the most fundamental problem in Asia today, I would say the most fundamental problem is that the Asian mind still remains decolonized, remains colonized, and refuses to believe that actually all these great Western universities, all these great Western think tanks, all these great Western newspapers like New York Times and Boston Globe and Washington Post don't understand the world. They just don't understand the world that has emerged. And of course, that leads to all the problems of our time, and that leads to the demonization of China that leads to this massive US-China contest and problems that are generated by failures domestically that result from plutocracy, that results from, in a sense, capitalism having gone wrong in the United States are blamed on China. And we don't have the capacity to respond and say, actually, don't blame China. The real source of your problem is domestic. And if you want to win the contest against China, you got to figure out how you became a plutocracy. And that's why I devote a whole chapter to plutocracy in my book, and reverse that. Because unless you reverse plutocracy, China is going to win the contest. But what you don't find in Asia is a kind of a significant enough intellectual pushback against the conventional ideas in the West. So this is why I hope, this is also why I wanted to participate in this book launch of Maui and Michael, because I think it's very important for more Asian voices to speak out and to explain how the West has fundamentally lost its way, how it needs to, in a sense, stop blaming the rest of the world for what's happening, and look at the mirror, look at what it has done wrong with itself. And then if we can fix that, I think the rest of the world will be happy to participate with United States. And so, in a sense, if we can do that, then I think, frankly, the best case scenario is of the West and Asians working together rather against each other to try and fix the world economy. So I hope a discussion like this will be helpful in this sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you for that passionate and articulated with great conviction, and putting Mahui and Michael's book in that context of the failure of democracy, capitalism, and globalization. And I guess that book is the start of the decolonization of the Asian mind. Let's hope. But to be fair, I think the person who wrote the foreword to the book, Andrew Sheng, has also contributed some ideas as well to give a different and perhaps more Asian perspective of these ideas. Yeah. So thank you very much, Kishore. I think that really puts us on a fantastic footing, and a great opening now for Hui to come in with his take on Mahui and Michael's book. So over to you now, Hui.
Okay, thank you, Manu. Well, Maui has written a very wide-ranging book, a critique of basically capitalism and the marketization of the society and the distortion of values, and as a result of that, you get all the structural crises of the times, including the pandemic, financial crisis, the destruction of the environment and all that. And then he goes on to talk about financialization, how that has captured the economy and has also distorted the functioning of the economy, because it's much more focused on the extraction of value rather than production. My comment will be much more narrow than Professor Kishore, as usual. I'll focus much more on 2 points, which one is the marketization and the link with climate change, and the other is financialization and financial crisis. And I don't disagree with Mahui on his critique of that somehow society has been captured by markets, and especially beginning in the late industrial revolution, and its drive for profit, that has then fundamentally marketized everything, from the economy to society, where price has become the defining value of object. So I agree very much with him on that, and that to some, in a sense, has led to the excesses that we have seen in capitalism, a lot of the wastage, And because of the wastage, the excessive production of goods and services, the consumerism that we are in today, right? And so that it contributed to, over time, the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what I think you said the tragedy of the horizon, because it's too far away for most capitalists. Most capitalists are too short term. They cannot look that far away. But economists also see this as a problem of externality, where your two most precious natural resources are free, air and water, right? And because they are free, there is an excessive there's a wedge between the cost of production and the benefit that you derive from, and so one way in which the economists would think about this is that you need to put a price, right, on pollution, and that's the way you tackle the problem. So that, and again, ironically, if you follow the approach, you're marketizing air, right? Something which only the state can do, because the private sector is not able to. So you impose a tax on carbon emission, and that contributes basically towards the curbing the emission, But that on its own is not going to solve the problem, because we know that that may change the the pattern of consumption and all that. But the bulk of the emission is contributed by energy, the need to produce energy in order to drive production and the economy, right? And so unless technology is able to come up with green technology, green energy, we are not going to be able to fundamentally solve that problem, right? And so there's a scientific angle to the whole problem, which is independent of the whether the system is the kind of economic system that we live in, right? And the other aspect that I think is missing from this critique is that we sort of agree that production has contributed to all this pollution and destruction of the environment. But on the other side, the market economy, as we know, is probably the most efficient institution invented by man. And we see that, for instance, in the case of China, where they basically abandon central planning, and move into marketize the economy, what they call the opening up and reform, right? It's basically marketization of the economy. And that has contributed to an explosion in productivity and growth, as you yourself pointed out, right? And it lifted 800 million people out of poverty, as Professor Kishore just mentioned. So there is the other side of this, massive expansion in production, which has led to a massive improvement in the per capita, in the welfare of the people. I mean, they basically the poor economy 400. They basically went from 400 billion to what today is about $17 trillion economy, right? An increase of almost 20-30 times in terms of the per capita income. So there is that side of the equation that I think we tend to miss when we just look on the negative side of the system. I guess the challenge has always been how do we control the excesses of the system. And here I think it's not just the left wing and all that. Even I think mainstream economies and die-hard capitalists recognize the failing of the system. But and everybody's struggling to come up with how to go about addressing this problem. So your proposal, to rebalance the three big factors: society, market, and the economy, I think it's most welcome. But how do we go about achieving such a transformation, your third transformation? And you said, hopefully the third transformation will be, triggered by this crisis that we are in, coming out of it. And we do hope that something will indeed come out of it. The other thing that you mentioned is financialization. And it's true that, you know, in a sense that, again, the economy has been captured by finance, and this has led to all the excesses that we saw. But finance is also one of the great inventions of mankind. Without finance, you would not be able to allocate resources across time, from past to the present to the future. You will not be able to, you know, undertake the kind of investment that we have today, because, you know, be able to basically reallocate savings to people who want to invest, and you'll be able to plan for the future. So, but I think, you know, we always recognize that finance is something that has to be regulated. And this is why I think, in a sense, and because of the invention of fiat money, that makes the whole thing even more tricky, because in the past, money is, you know, in the form of gold or silver or something tangible. But once you start issuing fiat money, right, there's always the risk, the danger, you know, that, you know, it can get out of control. And which is why, you know, a lot of central banks, right, they have this monetary discipline, which is that they need to control the issues, the liquidity in the system, so that it's not excessive, so that it doesn't give rise to inflation. And this is the great moderation that we saw back in the 1980s and 90s, where the you know, obsession was on high inflation. Now we are back in again in a situation where inflation is picking up, and we're trying to, you know, understand whether it's because, you know, central bank has already lost control of the money supply. The other aspect of the financialization is, you know, what you could say the deregulation in the 1970s and 80s, which is the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system and the expansion of and basically liberalization of the capital account, okay, which allows the capital to move freely, not just within the country, but across countries, right? And this has always been a big danger, because when money can be moved across country, then there's a risk that there is excessive lending, excessive borrowing, you get high debt, and then you had a balance of payment crisis. And this is what we saw, you know, in Latin America, in Asia, and elsewhere. We don't see that in the US only because the US, you know, is able to print money in order to service its debt, you know. And in the US, so what we saw is a danger of inflation, and they need to be able to control inflation if they are going to maintain their status, I think, as the reserve currency of the world, you know. If they lose that, I think they're going to lose that so-called exorbitant privilege of being able to service their own debt, you know. And this is the reason why, you know, you have the regulators coming together, you know, in the BIS, you know, and they have come up with very strict regulatory framework, you know, Basel I, Basel II, Basel III, and they have also come up with regulatory for the securities market and so on. But it is a constant challenge for regulators, you know, to try to control this. And you know, recently, because of the pandemic, we see an explosion of liquidity, as you pointed out. You know, the bank, central bank balance sheet went through the roof. You know, but you know, I guess here the issue for policymakers is, if they had not done that, you know, you could have had a repeat of the Great Depression, right? One of the I think one of the achievement of you know, modern economic or macroeconomic is that, you know, you can have a situation where you have a collapse in demand, you know, across and the only institution that's able to offset that is the government and the central bank, you know. And so they have had to do that, and that has led to this big explode, you know, massive buildup in debt of the central bank and the government at the same time, right? But now that has been offset to some extent, of course, because the private sector was not borrowing, right? But that is not true across all the countries. So you have a situation now where, you know, the overall leverage has gone up, you know, and everybody is very fearful about what that means in terms of the next financial crisis that you're talking about. So I think, on the one hand, we all recognize that there's something wrong with the system, right? I mean, the system has been hijacked to some extent by finance and also by, as you said, and it has led to all this wastage. And at the same time, these are existential questions that has to be addressed immediately. I mean, the third transformation is great, but we cannot wait for the third transformation to take place before we address all these issues that that you identify. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Hui, for that very thoughtful critique of the book and identifying the role played by externalities, the importance of the market as an institution, and also to remind us that despite its failings, finance does have an important role to play, and the real challenge is how to balance all these different needs. I think we're doing very well on timing. I would like to bring Dr. Michael Heng in for his comments, but he has said that he'd prefer to come in when there are questions, comments, and discussion points to address. So we already have one question. I would really encourage the audience to plug in more questions in the Q&A or the chat function, and I'll be happy to raise that with the speakers. In the meantime, let me pose a few questions to each of the speakers so far. To Mahui, I think the general feedback is that the ideas are really, really good and very interesting, and certainly contribute to the discourse on the challenges that we face. But the real challenge is to convert that into action points that achieve your third transformation. Third transformation is not going to happen unless there's a political change. But that political change is not going to bring about the kind of changes you want unless it is supported by deep intellectual thinking and well thought out, clear agendas for action. So if I were to ask you, what are the specific policy changes that you think that can be pushed into an agenda for the next president of the US or the next leader of any of these major economies? What are the 3 or 4 big actionable points that you would pose? That is to Mahui. Secondly, to Kishore, I think the great takeaway for me is the decolonization of the Asian mind. But can I ask you, I mean, are you referring to decolonization, or are you really saying that perhaps we have been overly influenced by certain strand of thinking in America? Because in Europe, as you also mentioned, the thinking, the social model and all are actually very different intellectual tradition, which has not actually had that much influence on the Asian mind, whether for good or not. Are you really referring to the perhaps excessive influence of one particular strand of American thought? And again, I'm a practical man. What can we practically do to change that for the better? And thirdly, to Hui, there's a question from the audience regarding the point about externalities, actually. And the question is whether pricing in negative externalities could lead to a better understanding of the actual growth trajectories. And then would that be enough to get us to reconsider the need for constant growth, which happens regardless of environmental degradation and other problems that causes? So if you could address that. So perhaps I'll start with Mahui first. Thank you.
Mahui, you're muted.
Yeah, as Kishore says, the book is not to be measured in terms of some of the answers to be given. Of course, we should do that. And I don't think, I can give real answers for all times and all societies. Depends on the political situation and economic and all stuff. But nevertheless, what I'm trying to push for is we have to be bold in our thinking and offer alternative narratives, because narratives are very important. Narratives is not just a story. Actually, all of social science is about narratives, spinning out, weaving narratives for people to believe in to buy in. And from that, you know, policy actions and all that flow. So narratives are socially constructed. They are performative in the sense that they shape our perception, they organize our worldview, they influence our decisions and our policy actions and all that stuff. Now, just to give you an example, right? There was this big shift that we all talk about in the 70s from, you know, industrial managerial capitalism to finance capitalism. More importantly, too, one is a narrative from what some people call stakeholders capitalism to shareholders capitalism. That's basically a narrative. What is that narrative of people like Milton Friedman and Jensen? No, piggy bank on Hayek, is that, look, an economic organization or corporation has only one objective. That is to maximize value and profits for the shareholders. Don't bother about all the other stakeholders, be they employees, customers, people, you know, the state and all the stuff. Those things can go to hell. And we just do this. That is a narrative, right? And from that narrative, you just imagine what has happened. It is captured, the state is captured, you know, all this. So what I'm trying to do is to shift that narrative. I think so. I think it's very important. And then when certain narratives are being pushed, socially constructed, pushed by certain interest groups, then what is the role of social scientists, particularly of economists? They legitimize it. Even the whole concept of market and Smith and all that, legitimizing, right? The rise of commercial capitalism, and then the physiocrats, you know, are in disrepute because basically, you know, interest is bad, agriculture and land is passé and all that stuff. So it's all about narrative. We should not underestimate that we need to capture the imagination. So that I think is very important. I'm trying to push for a narrative, right? And from that, so my narrative is, as I said, is not simply, then the question is, instead of maximizing rate of return of capital, you know, where Wall Street measures, oh, now we get the 20% rate of return of capital, then our stock price goes up. Why is it that we cannot have a different type of economic organization? Like Schroeder's Bank, right? It's a social bank and it's the largest social bank in the world. But by large, it's actually very small by conventional standards. It's about $10 billion US. Right? And there, they do say that finance is important, as Hoey says. But you know, it's not just making profit. They don't make loans if it's environmentally destructive. They don't make huge profits. And the salaries between the lowest paid worker and the CEO is no more than 5 times. What is it that, you know, makes the CEO have 500 times pay, of that of his ordinary worker? But that is again because of the narrative of the shareholders' capitalism. So that I think is a very concrete example of where we can shift the narrative and with the actual meaning. So if I have to tell the United States Obama, and of course he won't do, what do I have to do? You got to tame finance. Federal Dallas Bank told you, you got to bring down the JP Morgan and all these people to the level where they should be. I'm not saying bring down JP Morgan. I used to work in JP Morgan or Chemical Bank. I started off my banking career in New York City in 1985 with Chemical Bank, which took over Chase Manhattan Bank, and later Manufacturers Hanover, Chase Manhattan Bank, and they took over JP Morgan. But because Chemical Bank is associated with, chemical, so they said, that's not a sexy name. Let's put it JP Morgan Chase. I used to work there for 7-8 years. I used to work in Deutsche Bank and in Credit Suisse, and I know the banking industry in and out. What is important, what is not important. All these derivatives, as Volcker says, the most important financial innovation is the ATM. And Warren said, the other rest are just financial weapons of mass destruction. So what should the banks do? I mean, the regulators do. Snuff out all those unnecessary derivatives. Tax them. So that's what I would advise them. Sorry, I took too much time.
Thank you, Mahui. But can I just follow up with that one particular specific point? And I think it's a very important takeaway from your book, which is the nature of the economic organizations that we empower is very important.
Yes.
And I want to ask you specifically, I mean, I think the community bank thing is a very interesting idea. What about the broader idea of having an economy where cooperatives play a bigger role in society? And I want to make it very specific, and I hope not controversial, but you know, in the early days of our very successful economic development in the 70s and 80s when inflation took off, the government actually encouraged the growth of cooperatives in Singapore. So we had NTUC Comfort, which was a great way of providing employment to people, but also a fair and well-priced taxi service. We had NTUC Income, which I think gave very good value insurance products to the average Singaporean. And of course, we had Fair Price, which tried to ensure that people could buy their daily essentials at a fair price. And the thing that I think Singapore really showed the world was that cooperatives can be very well run. They can make a decent enough profit, but at the same time, deliver to stakeholders, not shareholders, but stakeholders, a good return. So there was a good social return. Would you agree that we should really have more cooperatives, or has that idea somehow gone away and that somehow cooperatives are unable to achieve scale and therefore may not be practical solutions to our problems?
No, I completely agree that cooperatives are important. And as I said, there should be alternative forms of economic organizations, and cooperative is one of them. And the other one, I would like to say, is like, you know, you must have heard of the Mondragon Society in Spain, where they are basically like cooperatives and they do a lot of things like that. So, you know, like Mount said, let 1,000 flowers bloom. But then we must know what are the raison d'etre and the rationale and thing that motivate this type of economic organization. Is it to maximize profit? Then we're back to square one. We cannot. We should, you know, open up alternatives. And I want to just say that I don't want to say that market is not important. And the big takeaway I get from Karl Polanyi is his ability to unpack the concept of market into economic tool, right? To clear goods and services, you know, allocate prices and all the stuff. Market economy, which is a profit-oriented economy, which I'm against, and definitely a market society where everything, including, you know, religion, culture, and all that, has been infused with market value. We have to bring down those two. And for market economy, I'm saying that we have to start thinking about social economy. I don't have, you know, answer to that. If I do write the third book, it will be from market economy to social economy, where the market as an economic institution will still play a role, but it has to be subsumed and, you know, subordinate to society and to planet.
Thank you, Mahui. Kishore, would you like to take the question I posed? But feel free to comment on other points that have been raised so far as well. Thanks, Kishore.
Yeah, I mean, the subject of course, the decolonization of the Asian mind is a huge subject. It will take about 100 years, I think. We are just at the very beginning of it. And of course, you see, if you look at it seriously, look at all of us. Where were we educated? Where did we study? Who do we cite? I mean, whether it's Hayek or Polanyi, or frankly, you know, in my case, the two philosophers that I studied was the other Karl Marx and John Rawls, right? So clearly, many of these big ideas come from them. And we haven't yet produced anyone who's actually can match these big ideas. But in many ways, we don't even have to produce the big ideas ourselves. We can start by pointing out that actually the Western societies have deviated from the principles that they espouse consistently in the past. So, for example, just to give a concrete example, it's the United States which convened the Summit of Democracies recently. 100 countries went there. And the assumption there, of course, is that the United States is still the #1 most effective, the most shining democracy in the world. But that's a classic case of, the emperor not wearing clothes. It takes a child to tell the emperor, actually, you're naked. And the American functionally is not, as I say, not a democracy, it's a plutocracy. And the net result of it, sadly, and this is documented over and over, that the wishes, the American democracy has failed in a fundamental fashion because the wishes of the majority are not reflected in the decisions that are made by the country. In fact, I read something else much more recently, like the bottom, the 100% have impact on 20% of public policy decisions, and the top 1% have an impact on 80% of the public policy decisions. So this is all documented. But even though this is in some ways the world's largest fact, okay, the world's most, strongest, most respected democracy has lost its way, and we in Asia don't know about it, don't talk about it. We just continue to assume, of course, if the United States does it, it must be right. So that's the first step towards decolonization, to sort of understand that this is a different world. And then, of course, step 2, and this is the hard part, is that the reason why we still, I suspect most of us get up, as I do, frankly, reading the New York Times and other such newspapers, because there is no other global outlet that has the resources to match the reach of these organizations. Although I see now sliver of hope with the internet and so on and so forth. And as you know, I'm genuinely shocked that a book called The Asian 21st Century was downloaded 600,000 times, and by the way, in 90 over countries. So the reason I cite the example is that there may be a window of opening if we use the larger internet platforms to get our ideas across. Because there is, in my view, there is a hunger around the world, frankly, in Africa, in Latin America, for alternative views. But the alternative views don't get expressed. I mean, if you read the New York Times, for example, the columns, all the minds are actually entrenched in a very narrow, liberal, democratic mindset. And if you don't speak from that perspective, you don't get the space in that newspaper. I mean, occasionally there are exceptions, but by and large, you don't. But that worldview, that narrow, liberal, democratic worldview, reflects the views of a very tiny minority of the world's population that is amplified through the amplification process. So unless you can create alternative channels, there'll be a big struggle. But this, by the way, this is also part of human history, as I've said in the recent column. First, you have the shift of economic power, which is happening to Asia. That's absolutely real. You can't stop it. After the shift of economic power, as Karl Marx said, first you change the substructure, then superstructure will change later. And then the shift of intellectual power will come. But you'll be, in some ways, I'm actually very glad I'm alive today, because I think in the next 10 to 20 years will actually be very exciting for Asia, because there'll be dramatic things happening in this region, and it's a result of the shift of economic power to this region. So the decolonization will happen very slowly.
Thank you, Kishore. Hui, if you could address that point about externalities.
Yeah, no, I think externality is one reason, as I mentioned in my earlier remark, why there's an excessive emission of carbon dioxide into the air. And imposing a carbon tax is one way of addressing the externality, because we underestimate the cost. So, and there are all kinds of externality out there. We know that in healthcare, in education, there are all kinds of externality. And these are areas where, you need the public intervention in order to be able to correct the wedge between, the social benefit and the cost. So by doing so, I think we'll be able to, you know, affect the supply and demand for those kind of services. But you know, fundamentally, you know, whether it's going to lead to lower growth, which is the question that followed, will depend very much on what the alternative is. I mean, the alternative to fossil fuel is some form of green energy, but the green energy is at the moment is still not widely available and is still quite expensive, right? So until that becomes you know, much more widely available, inevitably you're going to have a somewhat lower level of consumption of fossil fuel, right? Especially for the countries that are consuming a lot of fossil fuel, like in the US, you know, and I guess in China as well. But China's problem is also not just fossil fuel; is the carbon, the production of the coal of power using coal, right? And so all these countries are facing a difficult transitional problem because you're moving away from, you know, a supply of energy which is much cheaper to an alternative which is still not quite readily available, right? Fortunately, of course, solar, wind, and you know, hydro is becoming more and more available and cheaper. But you know, to be able to compensate for coal, I think it's just not possible at the moment. So it'll take a long time for that to happen. In the meantime, of course, people can adjust their living, especially in the so-called advanced economy, where you have you know, excessive consumption to some extent. They will shift to other forms of consumption. But you know, but for the poor countries, the developing countries that are still struggling to, you know, emerge out of poverty and all that, it's very hard to tell them, okay, to stop the using fossil fuel in order to save the planet, you know, because to them, I mean, they're just starting off on a journey of you know, making themselves better off. So until, you know, so there's this tension here between, you know, trying to curb the emission production in the air versus the other problem, which is poverty in the vast majority of the you know, developing country. And so you need to find a balance when we trying to address this issue, that we need growth. We cannot just, you know, reduce growth, because we need growth in order to lift everybody up, you know, to a certain decent standard of living. And inevitably that means that we're going to need power, you need energy, but and so the faster we can come up with different forms of energy to you know, I think the faster it will be for everyone and better for everyone in terms of addressing this problem. So there's this difficult trade-off that has to be made, you know, in terms of addressing this problem. But I do agree that maybe for the advanced economy, you know, there's definitely potential for them to lower, you know, the consumption of fossil fuel and move to other. I mean, and already that's happening. You know, people are moving from, say, driving cars to taking the bicycle, or, you know, walking. You know, I mean, the cities can be reconfigured in some way, you know, to minimize the use of combustion engine, fuel engine, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Hui. A couple of other questions coming in, but I think I'd be remiss if I didn't give an opportunity for Michael Heng to give some comments. Vivian, is it possible for Michael to be given the opportunity to speak? Can you open up the mic for him?
I don't think so. I will try, but I don't think so.
Oh.
I have to.
I think he has to log in through one of our links. Yeah. Maybe it can be Mahui again. Then you three Mahui.
Yes.
Because I can't do that at my end.
Yeah, I am checking.
You got to send in our link. you know. So they can
Most probably, Prof. Kishore's link, I can, because it's already in the chat. Let me check.
So, Michael, if you check the chat, there's a link which you can connect on, which will enable you to.
I will send it to the participant. One moment.
So in the meantime, while we sort that out, maybe there are a couple of questions that came in. One is specifically to Kishore from someone from Mr. BM Lap, who says he's an old friend of yours. And he's asking that, you made a comment about US democracy failing, but he feels that you didn't make any comment on democracy in China. And he feels that you may want to make some comment on what do you think about democracy in China.
Thank you. Beam is a very good friend. By the way, just a procedural point. I think we only have about 10 minutes left, right? Am I correct? So I won't take up too much time. But I think the Chinese political system is very different from the American political system. I mean, let's be very clear. And the Chinese, of course, claim that they also have a democracy. But as you know, if you follow the standard English definition of democracy, which says that you got to have a government that is chosen by the people at the ballot box, for example, that being a necessary, not necessarily a sufficient condition, but necessary condition, then China is not a democracy by that English language definition of democracy. But if you look in terms of the purpose of a democracy, and the purpose of a democracy at the end of the day is to improve the livelihood of its people and to have a government that serves its people. And here, the record of the Chinese government over the last 30 to 40 years is that it has delivered improvements to the Chinese people of a level that the Chinese haven't seen in 3,000 to 4,000 years. So the past 30 to 40 years of human and social and economic development in China have been the best to 30 to 40 years in 3,000 to 4,000 years, which is why there's a Harvard Kennedy School study produced by the Ash Center that shows that support for the Chinese Communist Party I think has gone up from 86% in 2003, I think, to 93% in 2016. And this is the Harvard Kennedy School studies. I presume they had all the peer review processes and so on and so forth. So there's absolutely no doubt that the government in China enjoys legitimacy, enjoys the support of its people. But if you say to an American audience that the Chinese government is legitimate as seen from the eyes of the Chinese people, the Americans will say to you, by definition, the Chinese government cannot be legitimate because it is not chosen by the people in a ballot box. So this is where, by the way, the use of language becomes very, very important. And one thing that as part of the decolonization of the Asian mind that has to take place is that we got to deconstruct many of these terms and understand how the meaning can be loaded to say, hey, only if you have X are you legitimate. And if you have Y, by definition, you're not legitimate. And what hasn't changed so far is that the Asians haven't come up with terms of their own, concepts of their own to explain the Asian phenomenon. Because what's going to happen in Asia is that you're going to have a whole variety of governments of different shades, okay? And what's interesting, by the way, just to illustrate that, there's, you must also bear in mind there's political agendas behind all this. So when take for example, the United States, when it looks at the Chinese government, it says it's imperfect, not chosen by the people. But because Vietnam is a useful ally, it doesn't say the Vietnamese government is illegitimate. It says Vietnam is a good friend of the United States. So, You know, so just, you got to understand that this is all geopolitics.
Thank you, Kishore. We are indeed running out of time, but there is one point, I think, which Kishore had raised and which Mahui may want to tackle. Kishore mentioned that you made that remark about capitalism and democracy not being compatible, and he wanted you to explain. So if you could give a quick, quickly address that question, that would be great. Thank you. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Mahui, we cannot hear you.
Mahui, you're on mute. Mahui, you're on mute.
We cannot hear you. Cannot hear you.
You're on mute, Mahui. We can't hear you, Mahui.
I think he lost him on the audio.
Something wrong with the audio, maybe.
I already asked him to unmute.
Yeah, he's
Yeah, I was
muted. I
trying
don't
to
know.
unmute him. I cannot do it.
He cannot do anything about
There's
it.
something wrong with the audio.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. My technical glitch. Okay, unfortunately, we have indeed run out of time. And at ESS, we try to stick closely to the time that we promised. I think there's just too many insights that came out of this for me to summarize very easily. But I think the big takeaway is that the point that Mahui made about the need for changing narratives. It is when you first change a narrative, then you influence policy, and then finally you influence politics, and then that results in big change. So we really are at the beginning of a very long journey before we can see the kind of changes that are indicated as necessary by Mahui and Michael's book. So with that, let me first of all thank Mahui and Michael for writing a book that is really making us think, which is, I think, very important, helping to change the narrative. Let me thank Kishore Mahbubani for extremely articulate and convincing addition, supplementation to Michael and Mahui's ideas, and to Hoi for anchoring the discussion on hard realities of the need for the market and finance.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, something wrong with my other computer.
Okay.
I don't know, but there's an echo.
There's a slight echo, but why don't you just very quickly summarize your view? Yeah.
I wanted to answer the question that Kishore raised, which is very important, right? I would slightly differ from Kishore in terms of the definition of democracy. Actually, 40 years ago, Mr. Popora and myself wrote an article about the incompatibility of capitalism and democracy. Now, democracy, is origin from Greek word, which is demos and kratia, which is people's rule or people's power. So democracy is a political concept where whether it's a small organization or a small town, people have direct participation in decisions that affect them. That's democracy as an abstract conceptual. Whereas capitalism is an economic category. In this case, specifically economic organization, where there's governed by private property, profit motive, and the guy who is calling the shot is the boss, the capitalist. There's no such thing until maybe today that the workers and the people have a say. So essentially, there is incompatibility between democratic and capitalism as an economic organization. Now, the democracy that we are talking about normally is electoral democracy. But what is more important, classical theories like Rousseau and all that, they talk about participatory democracy. That is not happening, either at the local level or at the national level. And that is why For me, more important than electoral democracy is participatory democracy. And participatory democracy is essentially anathema to capital. That's why theoretically they are incompatible. But these are all conceptual categories. And of course, I would love to have a longer discourse with Kishore when I meet you in Singapore, Kishore.
Right. Okay, thank you, Mahui. And I think we really have went over our time. So again, let me conclude by thanking every one of you for participating, and thank you, the audience. I'm sorry we couldn't go through every single question, but I think we've covered most of the ground. So once again, thank you. Have a lovely Friday evening and a great weekend ahead. And do download Kishore's book if you haven't downloaded already.
For free.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. Thank you for moderating.
Bye.